So thanks everyone for joining me and for interest in the talk. And I'll just start off with a little intro about orchids in general. They're the largest plant family in the world. So it's just a really huge group of plants, almost getting close to 30,000 different species, and there's hundreds of thousands of man-made hybrids. And what's very interesting, it's a very old plant family. There's records going all the way back to 80 million years ago. So it's a really diverse, large plant family that's had so much time to evolve over the millennia. Here's a picture of the largest orchid in the world on the left there beside that gentleman. And then not even the smallest orchid in the world. Look at that little guy. It's not even as big as a little thumbnail there. So it's just a very diverse plant family in size, as well as in shapes and colors and forms. So here's just a few tropical species. You can just see such a diversity in shapes and sizes and colors. And that's part of what just got me captivated as a young boy, is just such incredible colors and shapes, and the adventures behind finding them. It's just a very captivating plant family. Orchids, like some of our really nice camas and lily species, it takes up to 7 years for them to be blooming size. And so it's a very patient game. They've got tiny little seeds, and they rely on mycorrhiza fungus to grow. They have they tap into the mycorrhiza and get that energy from the fungus, and that's the only way that they can sprout their seeds. So it's a very special relationship. And most people think that orchids are rare, but it's actually those special mycorrhiza sites in the wild that are the rare parts, and then the seed and the orchid then find those rare little spots. So on Vancouver Island, we're very lucky to have a lot of different species right at sea level, all the way up into the mountains. And I'll be taking you kind of through the seasons today on all the different species you can see as the year goes through, and kind of give you an idea of what type of habitat you can find them. And I've definitely highlighted the ones that grow on your beautiful Mayne Island. So I'll have a little red M, and I'll definitely highlight all the ones that are found on your island. So it's sort of a toss-up on what species is the first one to bloom. I'm not on the actual Gulf Islands. I'm out here in Victoria, just out in Metchosin, and it's a toss-up for me between a little toy blade orchid and our beautiful calypso orchid. So some years one is ahead of the other. So I took the liberty of starting with our little lesser toy blade orchid, which is found on your island. And this is the first species that I find is in bloom every year, just around the end of March and early May. So get ready. I know it's a windy, stormy, dark day, but these little guys are underground right now, but come March, they just, little rosettes come up, and they start growing, and by the end of March, you'll have these beautiful little orchids coming up. They come in several different color forms. This is a really nice red form. This is sort of an in-between. You've got kind of a red and green, almost a bicolor. And you can see some of the detail there. These flowers are really tiny. I'll get you a better picture of the scale in a second here. And to round things out, you can have these beautiful pure green ones. So it's a lot of fun. Once you find a few, you can then start looking harder and try to find as many color forms as you can. And as I mentioned, this is a really good slide to give you an idea of how they look on the forest floor. Those are arbutus leaves, and you can see how tiny these little plants are. And you can kind of see there's a little smaller one here, and the little rosettes here. It's a really tiny little flower, and then you can really get close. And if you have a good camera, you can get a good shot of the little flowers there. So really cute little flowers. flower with a bunch of different colors, and definitely one to look out for at the end of March, early April. And second on the list, sometimes ahead of that little guy, is our one of our most beautiful ones, Our Lady Slipper, the Calypso. And it's just a beautiful, spectacular little orchid. I was on Gabriola Island this year, and I just could not believe how many I found growing right on the banks above the ocean. So I've got to go and visit the Gulf Islands a little bit more. I'd be really curious to know what kind of populations you guys have of this lovely little species. Similarly, these are some shots just out in the wild. I'm sure almost everyone has had the opportunity to find one of these out on a trail or something. Just a really pleasant surprise in early April. You get to be immersed in these lovely pink flowers. And they can be scattered like this as single plants, or plants as they get older can form rosettes. And a really old plant can be 15 years old, and I've had records of almost 30 flowers on one plant. So it can be quite a spectacular sight. And just recently, about 5 years ago, I was photographing, and I actually smelt the orchid, and I never thought to give it a smell, and it just has a beautiful, sweet fragrance. So be careful not to get too close and compact the ground around the flower, but it's a beautiful smelling orchid. Now, once you've found some of these populations, you can start looking at the nuances between them. I've discovered there's really two main color forms. There's the one on the left that has a lot of red pigment on the lip, and it's almost, in some forms, almost fully red there. Whereas the more common one, you've just got the speckling on the lip there. So I definitely feel that these are the two main color forms that you can find. So keep your eye out and just see how many spots you can find on a lip. Now, taking it another step further, you can have even more rarer color forms. I'm not sure if you can see here, but on the left, this stem is almost green, which means there's very few color pigments in the plant. Whereas just beside it, there's a lot more red in the stem, which means the flower has its normal color pigment. So this is a really rare, almost con color, almost getting towards an albino form. So this was a really rare find, and it's just such a treat to find something that special. And if that wasn't great enough, the holy grail of my orchid career was finding a pure white albino form. This was just incredible. As you can see, there's absolutely no color at all. This is a pure alba form of the Calypso, and it was just stunning. So keep your eye out. I think there's 1 in 80,000 can have the alba gene and be pure white. So it'll take a lot of searching to find one of these, but just spectacular. One that you don't have on the island is the striped coral root. This is also quite early, not like our regular coral root orchid that you've got on Mayne Island, but this one is definitely in the end of April. It's much ahead of the regular coral root orchid, and just a beautiful candy stripe, and you can see lots of flower variation. So if you ever make it to the Mayne Island here and are in mid to later April, keep your eye out for this guy. Now, this is the one you'll be more familiar with, which is definitely found on your island, and it is quite a common species, and just lots of fun to find. And it's got no leaves, so there's no green, there's no photosynthesis. This plant relies 100% on stealing its energies and tapping into that mycorrhizal fungal network in the forest. So it's a bit of a cheater, and it's using all of those other trees and plants to get all of its energies. Here's a wider shot of some populations can be quite big. You can just see how this is just wrapped around all that tree, and you can see there's some lighter color forms and then some darker ones. So you can see some different variations in the color. And this is a more standard color form, and they can form quite nice clumps. And then there's a really rare, and I'm not sure if it's been found on the island, but you can have a pure, this is as alba as it gets. It's got very few color genes, just the yellow in there. So it's a beautiful yellow form, and it's a quite rare one to find. So I know of a couple sites here in the Victoria area that I get to have a treat of this when it blooms. So a really rare form to keep your eye out for. That kind of takes you through April and May there. The coral root is definitely the most in bloom in May. And then in June, we get some more sort of coral root orchids. And the first one is Coral Rhiza mertensiana. Unfortunately, it's not found on Mayne Island. It's more of a mainland species, but it's got so many different color variations, all the way from the white one on the right there, all kind of different pinks. And you can have some really colorful, almost vinicolor, just large, dark purple ones. So this orchid can actually grow way up into the subalpine old growth forests on the mountains of Vancouver Island. So if it's done blooming down lower, you can hike up into the hills and find it blooming a little bit later up in the hills. So just a beautiful species. And again, it's in the coral root family, so no leaves and no photosynthesis. It's 100% reliant on those mycorrhiza funguses. One that's a bit rarer is it's the same regular coral root that's found on your island, but it's a special variety that blooms later on in the season. It's the last one to bloom, and it's lacking all spots. So they've got it as a its own variety ozentensis, and it's also found on Washington State. So it's kind of neat. Just on the in Ozette, Washington, you can find those there as well as on our island. So it looks like things might have been joined together at one time in history as the island and all that sort of broke apart there. So keep your eye. I'm not sure if it's ever been found on your island, but it's the one of the last ones to bloom and has no pigments at all. And then when the later flowering regular coral root orchid joins in with the early flowering of the other variety, you can get these natural hybrids, and they're just in between, and you can see characteristics of both. So where these two grow together and overlap just enough, there's the chance of getting a natural hybrid. So that's lots of fun to keep your eye out for when you're hiking in June. One of our rarest orchids on the island is the phantom orchid. There's some special sites found in Saanich on the Mayne Island here. It's just very elusive. It'll stay underground for years, and maybe when the conditions are just right, it'll bloom. I've seen times, 5-6 years in between blooming. So this is a real rare occurrence, and a really the phantom orchid is a great name for it. So beautiful species, and has a lovely fragrance as well. Coming into July, we kind of lose all that color that we had in early spring, and now we're into the whites and greens. So you may have noticed these luscious big leaves on the forest floor. These are actually the leaves of all of these orchids that are in the Piperia family. And what these orchids do is they get all of this energy from the sun in these big leaves, and they just use that energy to build up their flower stalks that happen in July. So I'm not sure if you can see in the middle here, those are shooting star leaves. So in April, you'll be able to see these luscious leaves, and the plant is getting all of this energy. And then before you know it, come July, when things really dry out, it loses all of its leaves. You can see down here, there's absolutely no sign of the leaves, but you've got these flower stalks, and the plant is using all that energy to bloom. So One of the most common ones we've got, and it's on your island, is Piperia transversa. Now, a lot of these are just kind of green and tall, so it's hard to differentiate them. But can you see this nectar spur here? It's very horizontal, and that's that transverse in the name. It's an easy way to identify this species is by looking at the nectar spur. It's got a really horizontal nectar spur. They're kind of hard to find because they've got that green and they kind of blend in, but once you see them, they're just these nice little green erect inflorescences. And here's another great picture of those really horizontal nectar spurs. So keep your eye out come July and look for the nectar spur. That's your key on how to identify some of these. Another one that's not recorded on your island is elongata, and you can kind of see, look at how this nectar spur goes right down the stem. It elongates down the flower stalk. So again, it's kind of tall and green, but if you look at the nectar spur, it goes right down. So that's a great way to identify that one. And then one of the prettiest, and you guys are lucky to have it on Mayne Island, is the elegant Piperia elegans. It's definitely one of my favorites, and it is just a spectacular species. You can see in this picture, the ocean is right there. They love coastal habitats, so I'm hoping a lot of you have had the opportunity to find one of these growing on the close to shore. It just puts out a beautiful display of these beautiful white and green flowers. And you can see they've got nectar spurs that go pretty close right down the flower stem. You can see some of these down here. And with all of the virus shutdowns, I was doing a lot of exploring just on my local areas, and I was really lucky to find a natural hybrid between that transversa one and the elegant one. So you can see on the right, it's quite subtle, but these nectar spurs aren't going quite horizontal, and they've got the nice green and white from the elegant. So the combination of the two were blooming just close together and created a beautiful natural hybrid. So keep your eye out. You both have these species on Mayne Island, and maybe there's that rare occurrence of a natural hybrid on your island as well. Likewise, when the other species are close by, this is transversa with elongata. You won't find that on your island, but you can see where the nectar spur is just right in the middle. So these ones are straight out, these are straight down, but the natural hybrid is kind of angled right on the angle there. One that is on your island and is actually quite easy to identify is Piperia unolensensis, and it's one of the few ones that actually keeps its leaves. It likes pretty shady spots, but you can really identify it. You can see this is much different than all of those other Piperia leaves I was showing you. So it's got these long kind of leaves and these little flowers with a little darker little eye there. So definitely easier to identify than the other ones there. Here's another couple pictures. You can again see much narrower leaves, and it kind of holds the leaves while it's blooming. So that's your kind of tip that you've found this other species. Moving away from the island, we had the little tway blaze at the start of the season. Kind of its sister species is the later flowering Neotecia, and it's got these luscious big leaves, and you'll find this more inland in those subalpine forests in the mountains, and it's got these little funny green flowers, but some of these leaves are quite luscious and neat. And as things are drying out, all of a sudden you might be lucky and you find the beautiful lady tresses orchid. Species with this spiraling effect. You can see here how it just spirals around, and if you get close enough without damaging the plant, it actually has a beautiful vanilla smell. So keep your eye out. It's amazing how, look how dry grass this is, and this beautiful little orchid is growing there. So definitely a really neat orchid to keep your eye out in July there, and don't forget to give it a little smell. They can grow in all kind of different habitats. This is right close to a lake shore. They prefer these acidic kind of environments and are really distinct, that kind of tress-like inflorescence. So that kind of finishes off the dry summer season. But if you still have that orchid bug, there's a lot of subalpine bogs on the island. And as everything is finishing blooming on our islands and close down to sea level, you can take an adventure up into these bogs and find all different kind of plant or orchid species in bloom. They're called the Plantantheras, and you can see a classic subalpine, sort of like Forbidden Plateau on Mount Washington. That's exactly the kind of habitat. You can see little orchids blooming all over the place. The tiniest of these is Plantanthera coryziana, and it took a long time to figure out how and where this little guy was blooming. It actually grows underneath these leaves of this other plant, and there's these tiny little green flowers, and they kind of look like little devil heads. It's just a really unique, hard to find little guy. So it's kind of the least showy of the group. Getting to a bigger, more green one is Plantanthera huronensis. These can be huge, almost up to 2 meters tall, big green, bold flower like that. The most common in the bogs is Plantanthera stricta. It's, again, sort of green and with the little stubby nectar spurs, but that one's very common in these subalpine boggy environments. And one of the prettiest of the Plantanthera family is dilatata, and it has these lovely white flowers, quite large, almost a centimeter across, and they have a beautiful, sweet fragrance, one of the nicest smelling orchids of our native species, and it's quite a showy species. You can see here, this is a classic shot of these bog environments. There's sphagnum moss growing down here. There's sundews. You've got summer gentians here, and then there's the flower there. So just a lot of fun when things are really dry and crisp to come up into these moist and abundant wet bogs in the summer. It's a lot of fun and a botanist's playground. And when the two species come together, here's a picture on the left. There's the stricta, the green guy, and then there's the beautiful white dilatata, and you get a natural hybrid. This is one of the few that's actually described. It's called Plantanthera estesii, and you can kind of see the mix between the two. You've got some of that white and the bigger flower, and then some of those green characteristics from the stricta. So it's pretty nerdy, but it's really fun for me to be hunting for these natural hybrids. They occur very, very rarely, so it's like a needle in a haystack when you find one of these in bloom. Now, if that wasn't fun enough in summer, when those stop blooming, you can go even higher up into our mountains. This is just on the way to Tofino in the Mackenzie Ranges. Just all of the wildflowers will start to be flowering. And just this year, one of our rarest orchids was rediscovered by a friend of mine. He led an expedition up into the mountains, and he rediscovered Cypripedium montanum growing on Vancouver Island from some old historical records. And they, I think, took 3 days to refine the location. But what a special find to see that this orchid is hanging on up in these special alpine habitats. Just a spectacular orchid, and what a find. So just a great way to end the summer exploration is this spectacular Cypripedium species. Back down to less colorful, and the seasons are slowly ending up, is a bit more of white and greens. We've actually got an invasive species orchid on the island, and I'm not sure if they've gotten to some of the Gulf Islands. I don't think it was recorded on Mayne Island, but it's called Epicactus helleborine, and it's incredibly prolific. It can seed itself and hook into all kind of mycorrhizal habitats. I've seen this downtown Victoria in Canadian Tire, a little bit of wood chips, and there it pops up. So it's just a really hardy orchid, and it can really take over a flower bed. So it's just interesting to have an invasive species like that. Now, I know we're in August and September, but this same Spiranthes, our lady tresses orchid that we had in July, it's the last orchid to be flowering up in the bogs. And I've been talking to a friend, Hans Romer, a really well-known botanist, and he's not sold that these two are the same species. You saw that the slide I had earlier, it was in super dry, absolutely crisp grass terrain, whereas these are fully growing in a wet bog environment. So it's really interesting that the same species would have such a diverse habitat range. So we need to do some DNA testing to see if this is really the same species or if there's some genetic differences there. And unfortunately, that's almost the season over of our native species. And the last one to bloom is our rattlesnake plantain. I'm sure everyone has seen these very colorful patterned leaves on a trail in the forest there. And this one is definitely found on Mayne Island. And it's got these kind of insignificant kind of white flowers. Depending how dry the season is, they can almost not open at all. They almost just self-pollinate. But if you've got a good year, you can see some nice detail in there. But what I find really fun is just almost hunting for their leaves. There's just such a very, very array of different leaf patterns. You can have some that are almost fully green, almost no white patterns in there. And then you can have some that are really spectacularly patterned like this. So it's a fun hunting game to just try to see the different kind of leaf patterns that you can find. And 2 years ago, I was on a trip in the Clayoquot area, and I found some of these growing epiphytically on trees, 30 feet off the ground. And it was just a really unique environment. And this year, I was able to re-find a whole different population also growing epiphytically on tree branches. So just because most of our orchids grow in the ground, there's definitely a species that is growing on our trees on the west coast there. So I think Mayne Island is too dry for this to happen, but on the west coast, up in the Clayoquot area, we've found orchids growing on trees. So pretty neat to have that happening above the 49th parallel like that. And that kind of ends the orchid season on our island. So I really appreciate your time, and we'll open it up to the questions there.
I think we have about 24 people here. So perhaps if people have a question, then we can unmute them and they can ask it. But there's a question here from Rob Underhill. Let's see. How can landowners promote orchid habitat on their properties?
I think depending, you know, what use is on the property, if it's a working farm or if it's just a private residence, is just really identifying that an orchid species is growing there, and then just really being careful to give it space. Even stepping within 2 feet of the orchid can compact the ground around the orchid. So really giving it space and making sure that the ground around it does not get compacted. And then also making sure that invasive species like Daphne, broom, blackberries, the ivy, all of those myriad of invasive species don't overtake and you know, smother out the special mycorrhiza and light levels of the orchid.
Oh, great. Thank you. And we have a question from Eve as well, who is now unmuted. Go ahead, Eve.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Sasha, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask more about the Calypso orchid. Uh, I had never seen it in Vancouver. And here, of course, we find it in many places, and some years more than others. But I'm curious exactly where is the reach. I've seen it once in Northern California in the Sequoia National Park or the Coastal Redwood National Park. But I wonder where else it can be found, and does it exist at all on the mainland, or is it purely an island flower?
No, so it's actually one of the most widest distribution of our native orchids. I don't know if you noticed in my slide, there's Calypso bulbosa variety occidentalis. So that's the one that's on the on our coastal islands and also on the sort of a coastal part of British Columbia. So they prefer Douglas fir habitat. They can be found also in subalpine mixed conifer woodlands. So they've got quite a range of habitat. And they actually, that variety goes out all the way past, sort of, it goes to the coast mountains and into the foothills of the sort of the Kootenays and that area, and then it actually then overlaps with just the regular Calypso bulbosa, which has a white lip with a yellow middle, and then there's a hybrid swarm of the variety occidentalis and the regular inland form. So it's a really neat species that there's a sort of a western coastal form, then you've got the mainland form, and it goes all the way out to Ontario and the maritime provinces. So it's widespread, you know, across the country. You know, it doesn't grow in the prairies, but it's just it's in unique habitats across the country. But definitely, it's got those unique sort of Douglas fir or mixed conifer untouched woodlands.
Wow, thank you, Sasha. Thank you for your question, Eve. We have not a question, but a comment from Ian. He says that he's from West Australia, which he calls an orchid paradise. He says there are 460 named species, plus some as yet unnamed, plus many hybrids. Very exciting. Another orchid enthusiast.
Right on.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any other questions that anyone may have? Great. Yeah. Rob.
Hey, Sasha.
Hi, Rob.
I was just wondering if you'd seen the orange color variant of the Calypso orchid before.
Orange one? No, I would love to see a picture of that.
I'll try and see if I can find one. I've seen it on Mayne and on Galliano.
Wow.
And it's pretty distinctly orange. It's like a faded kind of orange color, but I'll see if I can find one and I'll send you an email.
You bet. Yeah, and like I mentioned, we went to Gabriola Island, and oh my God, I just couldn't believe how dense the populations were there, just above the ocean in these just untouched, unlogged. It was still old growth Douglas fir. I just could not believe how dense it is. So unfortunately, it was a COVID year, so I didn't feel right to be traveling, so I didn't get to go check that out. But I'm sure hopefully Mayne Island has some unique little spots like that. So, and you know, being an island, you know, some of these color forms can be really unique. So it's an exciting thing to be exploring for.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest challenges that orchids have in our environment is the overpopulation of deer, with the fallow deer so abundant. You know, they're just finding any of the even the camas, you know, which is traditionally abundant in certain parts of the island. It's rare to see, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that's, yeah. Yeah, and I've been finding one of the biggest threats to orchids, other than urbanization and subdivisions that get rid of habitat, is unfortunately just overuse of our parks. Just in this year alone, due to COVID and all of the people getting out and hiking, I've seen trails triple, quadruple in size just in one season. I've seen so much dogs off leash, and unfortunately dogs off leash do a lot of damage. So it's just people loving these places to death kind of thing. So that's a really hard one, is how to keep people on the trail and manage that. That's just been heartbreaking. I go through pictures from decades ago, and so many lost populations due to trail erosion.
Wow. We have a question from Diane that does have to do with trails, it looks like. Diane, I've asked you to unmute if you're able to, or I can read out your question. Perfect.
Sasha, I didn't even know rattlesnake plantain were an orchid, and I've been successfully transplanting them away from where people would walk on them or anything. Are there other things we can do to either encourage them more or to transplant them?
So I've actually, we've got a tiny little spot of old growth Douglas fir, and I got from Habitat Acquisition Trust, gave me a couple rattlesnake plantains, and we've transplanted them there. There's certain mosses that they really like, where I'm sure the mycorrhiza is what they're looking for. And it is one of the most hardiest of our orchids, and it can be transplanted. What I spend most of my time when I'm hiking is, I'll see a corner of a trail that's starting to get eroded. So I'll just put either like a log around, or some rocks there. So just a lot of little things can just get people subconsciously to not step in that direction. So just, every time you're out there and you see a little section getting too close, you can, put some branches or put a little log to like a little bumper, so people can hopefully maybe avoid that side of the trail. So I spend a lot of time just trying to keep as what I can, from getting trampled or overdone there. So, and then education too. Yeah.
I was going to say, just to be really clear, it's on our own property that I'm
on your own property.
them around. It's not in the wild. Well,
yeah.
It is the wild, but
yeah, and the rattlesnake plantain, it's one of, believe it or not, the calypso orchid and rattlesnake plantain, those are the two orchids that I found can actually repopulate second growth and disturbed places. So I've got rattlesnake plantain at my parents' lawn underneath the rhododendrons. So yeah, and calypsos can repopulate, logged out areas. So they're much hardier. The calypso is very hard to transplant, but the rattlesnake plantain definitely can be moved if it gets put into a similar habitat.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Diane. I actually have a question, Sasha.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if orchids have any relationship with pollinators, if there's a strong relationship there, or...
Yeah, there's, it's just not studied well enough. I met a lady, I can't remember her name. She's up in Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, and she's been doing some huge studies on those plantantheras I was talking about, trying to figure out who are the pollinators, how do natural hybrids occur. So it's just a field that very few people know who's actually pollinating these orchids. At the start, those little tway blade orchids, I've always seen mosquitoes all on the flowers. So I'm sure if we did some study, I'm pretty sure those are the pollinators for those tway blades. So it's just sort of an uncharted territory. So, I hope there's some orchid nerds out there wanting to get to the bottom of who's pollinating those special plants.
Yes. Well, one reason not to kill mosquitoes.
That's right.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that answer. Does anybody else have any questions for Sasha? Great. Well, Let's see, it's about 8:15. Okay. Well, and if you have any other questions that you think of afterwards, you can always email the Conservancy, or Sasha, if you want to provide your contact, that's great. If not, we can just we can do it through the Conservancy email and forward it on to Sasha, and he can answer your questions that way. But this has been a very informative presentation. I've learned a lot. I didn't know that rattlesnake plantain was an orchid as well, so good to know.
Neither did
Right
I. I
on,
was
and-
very surprised.
No, yeah. Oh,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna keep your eye out for those piperia leaves. They're just luscious big green leaves, and then they just go away in summer and then come back, and you'll find some flower spikes there. So it's a neat one to keep your eye out for.
yeah, I'll definitely do that. Great. Eve says, thanks a lot, Sasha. Quite fascinating. And Jan says, yes, thanks so much. So
Right on.
great.
And, you know, if you have any feedback for the Conservancy on our Zoom presentations, you can send that to info@mayneconservancy.ca. We'd be happy to hear your feedback. Also, if you have any input into timing of presentations, whether weekends, weekdays, evenings, afternoons are more appropriate, please let us know.